there's an enormous amount going on at the moment around the world around Exascale. I mean, we're all aware of what's going on in Japan, in America, and in Europe. And some of this project grew out of the calamity that Britain finds itself in at the moment. So there's definitely a political frisson to this talk, which I'm not going to go into any detail on, but just join the dots yourself. So it became clear during the discussions around Euro HPC, which I was heavily involved in, from the end of December 2017, when the Sherpa meetings started taking place, that the UK was in a really quite complicated position around Euro HPC. It is very complicated in terms of what our future relationship will be. But because of the way Euro HPC has been set up, and this was clear from the beginning, it's highly unlikely that the UK can join Euro HPC. Because Euro HPC, the joint undertaking, is only accessible to member states or associated states. And from the very, very beginning of this Brexit saga, it's been clear that we're going to be a third country because we don't accept the four freedoms of movement, capital, etc., etc. So that gives the UK an interesting issue in as much as we see Europe motoring ahead in exascale computing. We see China, the US, Japan, and other countries. And the UK mustn't be left in the slow lane. So a lot of the discussion around this, which took place actually over quite a long period, relate to this political context. Around the middle of 2018, there were a number of things going on. So a lot of us in the UK, in the academic sector, were involved in work around UKRI's e-infrastructure roadmap. So for people who aren't from the UK, up until about 18 months ago, there were 7+1 research councils who were very, very independent. They met together in something called Research Councils UK, but really they were quite autonomous. Since then, they've come under a single name, UKRI, so you can think of it in American terms as the NSF. And the power of the individual research councils is actually much lessened. They're no longer independent, they're just part of UKRI. All of the people that worked in the research councils have new contracts, and the idea is to bring all of the research councils together so that they think more jointly, and particularly I think in the area of e-infrastructure, that's really important. It means for the first time we have had discussions across all of the sciences, all the research areas about what e-infrastructure is needed for the UK. All that's going on completely to one side of a different discussion, which was should the UK think about having an exascale computer? And so the BEIS, which is the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, for reasons I have never quite understood the university's minister is part of, decided that the UK, that an outline business case which would describe what an exascale project for the UK would look like would be written. And that's what I'm talking about today. So that's a very, very long first slide, but I felt I should explain some of the context behind this. So I was asked to set up, I'd been the technical advisor to the Euro HPC negotiations, and I've been going to all these Sherpa meetings with a series of civil servants. And one of the interesting things actually, and I suspect this is true of the whole Brexit thing, is the civil service has been I think I had 4 different people that went to me to about 8 meetings. I had probably the same person twice at each meeting. And this lack of continuity has made it really difficult. And I suspect this has probably happened in the whole set of discussions. But I was asked to set up a small group called the Exascale Project Working Group. And that had on it Susan Morell, who we all know and is retired now, and subsequently Richard Gunn, who's taken over from EPSSC, Alison Kennedy from STFC, Lee Lapworth, who's here from Rolls-Royce, Paul Selwood from UK Met Office, that many of you will know, and Mark Wilkinson from DIRAC, who's speaking tomorrow. Mark had a very specific role, or an additional role, if you like, in this, in that he was also chairing the Science Case Working Group that was writing a science case for supercomputing in the UK, of which part of that case looks to Exascale. And we were supported by two people, Nick Trigg and Chris Johnson, Chris from EPC, and also a couple of consultants who have helped me enormously with the economic case and navigating the complexity of this sort of bid to government. So we're tasked with writing something called a Green Book business case. Now, I have actually written one of these before, so I helped to write the Green Book business case for the city deal that Nick talked about. So I had previous form. The interesting thing about these things, these are the guides. The Green Book describes how the document you write is going to be appraised by government to decide whether they want to invest. And then this blue document, which I think should really be green, shows you how to develop your document. Now, the interesting thing is you're writing a 25-page document, but the instructions are 266 pages long. Okay, so that is the challenge. And Richard from the Met Office is grinning widely here. So it's an interesting task. I mean, I have to say I've really enjoyed it. And you're allowed 15 pages of annexes, but basically you're asking for a very large amount of money in a very few pages. So what the OBC tries to do is answer 4 questions. Do we need an exascale capability? And that's helped very much with the science case. What will an exascale computer look like? What will it cost? How will it be funded? And when and where would it be hosted? So let me set some of this in the international context, because I honestly think we're in the most interesting, exciting moment in supercomputing at any point in my career. We know that China are probably, I think, going to deliver an exascale system in 2020. Last year, the people that host and run the current big Chinese system, the Twilight system, they came and they gave a presentation, which sadly they didn't leave with me, but they said they would have an exascale system in 2020. And I've never seen that talk elsewhere. So I still believe they're going to do it next year. Obviously in Japan, and tomorrow you hear from Satoshi Matsuoka, all about the Fugaku system, which will be a system that is close to an exaflop. You just heard from Cray about Frontier and Aurora. And in Europe, obviously, you'll have seen the announcements around the pre-exascale hosting sites being chosen, Finland, Spain, and Italy, which will deploy their pre-exascale systems in late 2020. And then exascale systems based on the European Processor Initiative. And we very, very luckily have Jean-Marc Denis here, who's going to speak about the EPI project tomorrow. And I think, and this may be wrong, but I think the plan for that is exascale systems based around EPI in late 2023. So that's the international context. Now, you have to think in the UK about what sort of systems we want. And all of us have talked for many years about tiers, but tiers tend to upset people, particularly when tiers get drawn as a triangle with big supercomputers at the top and everything else below. And people get worried that it just shows that there's this supreme thing at the top and everything else doesn't really matter. So while these words may change in the business case, we've been thinking much more recently of a sponge cake model, which doesn't say which layer of the sponge is the largest or the most important, but it does say there are layers. Of course, one will be the jammy layer. If you think of the leadership class systems, I would argue are sort of internationally relevant systems. They're doing the most detailed simulations of the largest problems, and that's really where exascale is sitting. You've got then discipline or program-specific systems, and so the current Archer and Archer 2, the DRAT system, probably the Met Office system would sit in there because it's program-specific, but that doesn't mean that these systems are not very large. So, the current Met Office system is one of the largest systems, I think is the largest system we have in the UK today. The next one will be even larger, likewise Archer 2 and DRAC 3 and all this sort of stuff. And then below you've got entry-level and systems specific to particular facilities. And here are the tier 2s in EPSRC land. There's a number of systems in STFC land that support particle physics and whatever. So you think of them as tier 2s. And then you've got local university systems. So we've got this nice, oh God, I was about to call it a hierarchy again. It's so difficult not to call it a hierarchy. We have this nice ecosystem of systems. And really that's what the e-infrastructure roadmap is focused on thinking about. Getting this message across to politicians is really complicated because there's at least 4 thoughts here. So a lot of the business case involves trying to state this stuff very simply. So I mentioned the science case earlier. I'm just going to give 2 slides on this, and I think Mark will talk a little bit more about this tomorrow. As I said, UKRI have been developing this e-infrastructure roadmap over the past 18 months. A number of us have been involved in it. It's, in fact, much larger than just e-infrastructure. It's actually a review of scientific infrastructure in the UK. So it's everything from particle accelerators to big bits of medical equipment to computers, etc., etc. It spans, and telescopes, right? So it spans all the infrastructure you need to be one of the leading countries involved in scientific research in the world today. The e-infrastructure roadmap, we met several times over quite a long period in London, big group, about 100 of us at one point, about 80 to 100 people. And we kind of got split up into various white papers. There's a white paper in supercomputing that Mark Wilkinson edited, which many of us contributed to. And then it was decided that we also needed to put together a supercomputing science case, which kind of grew from the white paper, but it was a different process. What it did was it went out and it spoke to a whole load of the user communities and said, what would you like the next generation of supercomputing to do in the UK? What would 10 times more, what would 100 times more compute allow you to do? So it wasn't specifically Exascale, but it nodded towards Exascale. And that is now out being internationally peer-reviewed and will eventually be published in the same way that the Japanese case was published, the American case was published. So all of that's good. We focused on 7 themes which sort of span both traditional areas of supercomputing and areas that are massively growing at the moment. So obviously, engineering and materials, expanding the frontiers, so fundamental sciences, physics, astronomy, etc. Weather and climate, computational biology, computational biomedicine. And the biomedicine is interesting because this is an area of massive growth for EPCC. I mean, Nick described the safe haven, but we're not just seeing massive growth in the safe haven context, just generally around medical data, genomic data, and we've got 10,000 whole human genomes, for example, in Edinburgh, which has just been done in Edinburgh, which for a little country of 5 million people is not bad. There's plans to do at least 250,000 over the next few years in the country. So there's this massive growth of, you can call it data science, but actually it's data science that needs HPC scale of processing and data management. And I think that's why this is a very, very interesting moment in time. And then the other area, which is quite small at the moment, is digital humanities and social sciences, but definitely is growing. I mean, they certainly don't really have exascale problems today, I mean, maybe just 1 or 2. But they certainly, we wanted them to take part. And the final one was this idea of mathematics and science of computation, which is something I feel very strongly about. And Satoshi Matsuoka actually first used this phrase. He talked about science by computation and science of computation being 2 different things. So science by computation is modeling an earthquake. Science of computation is how do we design the systems and the software that we want to use so that we can support the next generation of algorithms. And in the UK, I quite often I like upsetting computer scientists. Partly because this university's got the biggest computer science school, certainly in Europe. It's one of the top 4 in the world. There's just hundreds of them, and so I always describe myself as a computer scientist just to upset them and talk about Fortran. And that upsets them even more. But certainly in the UK, we've gone down a road where there's quite a big gap between people who call themselves computer scientists and people who call themselves a supercomputing expert. And I'd like to see that change, actually. We're all really computer scientists. There isn't this schism in the US, for example. So, as we started off down this road, and in fact, before I even put the working group together, I was spoken to by various different branches of government, and specifically there are a whole load of bits of government that are interested in this. So the initial driver was the international team within BEIS, because they were negotiating Euro HPC. They're very worried about what happens to Britain in the context of scientific collaboration post-Brexit. But then there's also the Future Sectors team, which is part of BEIS and the Department of Culture, Media and Skills. And they're interested in next generation technology. So Exascale was on their radar, Quantum's on their radar, et cetera, et cetera. And they always come hand in hand with the Office of AI that's been set up to drive forward the UK's AI programme. And then within this context, I've also got UKRI as well. So I've been spending a huge amount of time just talking to different groups. And I was given a certain set of things that the working group had to focus on. So first of all, the system should support both traditional modelling and simulation and artificial intelligence deep learning applications. Now, for any of you that go and talk to government, there is an enormous amount of confusion about AI at the moment. So I've had to counter, in a number of occasions, this idea that supercomputers do AI. And I said, no. AI is a very important supercomputing application. Modelling and simulation is largely what supercomputers do. And these two things are coming together. But there's a dangerous view in government at the moment that they only do AI. We must avoid that at all costs. But the thing that's helping us with this top statement is that we know a whole lot of technologies that are coming along are going to actually help us run both deep learning, inference, etc., applications on the supercomputers that in the past traditionally have just done modelling and simulation. And that's because of the changes that are coming at the processor level, etc., etc. And then the other key thing I got, and this is from deep inside BEIS, was that the system must support both scientific user communities and industry users. And there's a key criticism that... Nick, can I ask you a favour? Could you go and get me a drink of water? Do you mind? There's a key criticism that in the past, industry's been kind of just tagged on to big supercomputing systems. And that's not to be the case here. So what we're proposing is a large InSight type program. But InSight in itself, I think, has flaws, in as much as I was talking to Susie Traynor from Oak Ridge recently, in fact, a few weeks ago in HLRS, River Bastion is. And she said that they felt that InSight, because it had this requirement that you need to be using, I think it's 20% of the machine, or it's of no interest, the InSight program. So we want to run an InSight type thing, but we also don't want to limit applications to a certain size of the machine. Because if you give people access to the machine, hopefully, the fact that they port their code onto it will make them want to do bigger and bigger things. So we want this to be a ramp onto doing bigger computing. And that also, thank you very much, that's really kind. Cheers. And he's a jack of all trades. I think it is important, but it's here that the different layers of the sponge cake are important. So, if you look at our Tier 2 system today, the majority of EPC's industry users work on that system. Some of them then progress up onto Archer, but the majority happily work there. And we've got, I think it's over 80 companies on a monthly basis actively using that system to do work largely that they just pay for access for. So most of the industry use will be for collaborative research, so not for production use. So once something goes from collaborative research to being used day in, day out as a production service, then the companies will be expected to pay. But if you look at the way many companies engage with large-scale HPC, they tend to use the national services to understand how their codes will run in 5 years' time on the services that they have access to either in the cloud or in-house. So I think I see the opportunity here is for industry and the scientific community to work really closely together to do things that have never been done before, which then become productionized later on. And I think you can make a really clear impact case around that for this investment. And then I've also got to give specific support for SMEs, but as you know, Britain's been really strong, and EPC's been really strong in working with SMEs and HPC over the last 20 years in fact. And then, and this is the political one, I'll let you work it out for yourself, the system should be operational by Q4 2022, Q1 2023. Initially, the plan, which had been discussed many times, was that around this time there was a pre-exascale system, and then maybe around 2026 there was an exascale system, but that was poo-pooed, and the EPWG was asked to write a case that looked at this time frame for an exascale system for the UK. So let's look at Summit today, and I have to say that I think Summit's been an enormous success, right? I'm very, very lucky and honoured to be on the Gordon Bell Committee, and you see all of these papers last year and this year as a committee member that have used Summit and done modelling and simulation that just was utterly impossible before this amount of compute came along. And that's where we've got to get to in the UK and in Europe, actually. And what I've been really impressed with is the way that people have thought, right, this is not a simple system to program. We're going to have to rethink how we model. We're going to try really hard. And it's clearly, reading some of the papers, it's clearly been extremely competitive. And I think that's really good. And I want to get this mindset going in the UK, because that's exactly what we need. One of the problems we've had, because, for example, Archer is now so long in the tooth, is that I think our computational science community hasn't had to challenge itself, with this scale, and hasn't thought, that's fantastic, look what the government's bought, now what can I do? That mindset dwindles the less you invest. The problem, looking at these numbers with Summit, of course, is, our peak 201, our max, I think 146 at the moment. It's been going up gradually, each top 500. Anyway, consumes 13 megawatts, which actually is less than I thought it was. But if you were to just simply roll this out, I mean, IBM will now start weeping, but you'd be 12 million CPU cores plus the GPUs and the massive amount of parallelism in them, and 65 megawatts. And very, very few countries are going to want to spend 65 megawatts of power a year on a system. So, new technologies are coming. So in all the work we've been doing, and those of you that go and have NDA briefings with the vendors will know this, that there really, I think, are two routes to exascale. There's the cores-only route, which is favoured by Japan. I keep calling this the Japanese model. I think there is evidence this approach leads to longer lifetimes of systems. I'll come back to that later. There's definitely, if you look at forthcoming processor designs, hardware support being added to normal cores-based processors, multi-core processors, to support AI. They're never going to be as fantastically powerful at deep learning as a GPU, but there's definitely more crossover between cores and GPUs. And one of the things we mustn't forget, of course, is that you can run any of the modern frameworks on a normal multi-core processor. You don't need a GPU to do that. The cores-only route probably leads to larger power requirements and greater physical dimensions. And then you've got the cores plus accelerator route, the chosen accelerator today being GPGPUs, favoured, I think, by the USA, but I mean, if you look at the Chinese model is that, it's not a GPU, it's something that looks a bit like a Xeon Phi. It's been very interesting talking to various people about this, because today, if I buy, say, 4 V100s with a multi-core processor at the heart, I get sold 2 sockets generally. And when you go around and talk to people, the sweet spot that we seem to have got to is about 10 cores per GPU on a blade. That seems to be the nobody can quite explain why this is, but that seems to be where we are in the general thinking. And as we go to the next generation of processors, like AMD's new AMD Rome processor with 64 cores, it looks, many of the designs going forward look like a single socket with, say, 4 GPUs around it. So, it's just a slight simplification. So I think one of the things we're going to see, in fact, we were having this discussion in EPCC the other day about whether or not we think general purpose blades are about to change as well. So is Exascale going to drive a change in the sort of compute blades we would buy that we just call general purpose? Are we going to have just multi-core blades in future, or are most blades going to have some sort of accelerator on them? I think that remains to be seen. I think I was going to catch up at this point. I'm nowhere near finished, so I'm going to keep on until past, if that's all right, yeah? So I said about the Japanese model, if you look at this, look at where the K computer is. This is now with HPCG, and this is just before the K computer was turned off. It's still third, and it's third largely because of the 5.3% fraction of peak number there, which is all to do with memory bandwidth and designing for science. So that's why the Japanese model is attractive. And we shouldn't forget that as we make this choice, which is a very complicated choice, and which I guess most countries are going through. So the key insights from the various NDA briefings I had is that high bandwidth memory is coming. Most exascale blades will have high bandwidth memory in a single address space. Many designs have no DRAM at all, although I've had discussions with various people about whether that's a good or a bad thing. The processor world's hotting up. We've clearly got Intel versus AMD versus ARM. That's great. GPUs are getting ever more powerful, and some of the ones coming along are just spectacularly powerful. And the other thing, which Gabriele showed a moment ago, is just the sheer density of energy that's going to be put into these cabinets. 300 kilowatts plus. And the first time I showed our data center manager the design of one of these cabinets, he just said, "You people are mad." This is really serious stuff. You don't trivially put that much power into such a small space. Almost certainly you can get to 1 exaflop theoretical peak with around 4 to 5 million cores. A cores plus GPU approach reduces the number of cores, but overall parallelism will increase, okay, because GPUs have got much higher levels of parallelism. So you can probably get a smaller system with the theoretical peak statement that it is an exaflop, but it is going to be much more difficult to program, I suspect. And then the power requirements range from about 20 megawatts to 160 megawatts in the various designs I've been shown, although there are some designs that are lower than that. Now, I'm not sure I entirely believe them. And then the size of systems is very, very dependent on the density of the blade. So some of the designs go from as few as 60 or fewer cabinets up to over 800. And I think one thing we mustn't ever forget is the key metric for all of this should be the usefulness for research, both for scientific and industrial research. I showed you this slide earlier. We're in the middle of expanding the ACF. So up until recently, we owned land. This is the old fence across to here. So I've just bought all this. There are horses on here. I don't know where the horses are now, but they're no longer there. We're building this room on the right here. I'll show you a picture of it in a minute. But the other thing we're doing is we're putting in a new primary substation with, I've taken a license for 24 megawatts of power initially, but it can go up to 32. So we've already got, as of yesterday, we've got 8 megawatts to site, because I'm increasing my license from 5 to 8 megawatts. So that would give us up to 40 megawatts. But I actually think probably around 25 megawatts will get you a reasonable exascale system, if we're lucky. The room I'm building, which is part of the city deal, which the city deal equipment is going in initially, has space for 270 normal cabinets, and either that will fit an exascale system, or you would just extend it, although we haven't told the builder that because he's not finished building the current building yet. This is where it becomes really complicated, actually, because you don't want to limit people's ability to bid, but at the same time you've got to limit the amount of money you're spending on your hosting environment. It is complicated. So you can see this is not a pipe dream, this is computer room 4, and in fact since these pictures were taken, the roof's now on, the floor's, I think the floor's in now actually, and it's going to be watertight at the end of October, and then we've got all the M&E going into it, and it'll be operational 1st of July, actually probably in June, because they're way ahead of schedule because it's not been a very wet summer. I also get criticised a lot for the amount of power I'm using, because I'm already well over a third of the University of Edinburgh's electricity bill. And once Archer 2 comes in, I'm going to be more than half. And since we're in the Centre for Climate Innovation, I thought I'd show you one thing. So in Scotland, every public organisation has to buy its electricity on a single contract the Scottish Government sets or negotiate. So it's a little bit like communist Russia. That's fine because you actually get quite cheap electricity. So you can choose what tariff you're on. You can go coal, a mixture, or 100% renewable. University of Edinburgh chooses the 100% renewable option, and you can see how that's made up. And last year we consumed 24.5 gigawatt hours of electricity. Cost 11.1 pence, in case you're wondering. But I'm still getting criticised, okay? So we've been having a think about what we do next. It just turns out that the data centre, so the ACF, is here. And these are old mine workings, all right? So if you're my age, you remember Bilston Glen. So when Mrs. Thatcher was closing the mines down, this was on the news all the time. And this mine's now it closed in 1988. It's gradually been filling with water. It's not quite up to the top yet, but it's pretty filled water. So we have decided to build a heat battery in the old mine workings. And this is the geology of it. You can see it extends about 5 kilometres towards Edinburgh. The plan is to inject, I'll come over here actually. So inject hot water, surface heat exchanger, so we can do this now probably. Surface heat exchanger, inject the hot water down here. Now the ACF's in the middle of nowhere. The problem we've always had with our hot water is nobody wants it because there's nobody nearby. But it's great because it's in the hills, so it's cool. So you give with one hand, you take with the other. But there's an underground river in the mine workings and in the geology. And gradually this hot water will flow underneath more populated parts of Edinburgh. The temperature of the water at the top of the mine, so there's a temperature inversion in the mine as you go closer to the centre of the Earth, even though it's only a kilometre, is 15 degrees. So if we do this, we're fairly certain that we can do free cooling all year round and just use this 15-degree water to do our cooling. So we never need any more chilling. And we've already calculated, because this is continuously being replenished, that we can easily put 40-degree water, we can put up to 40 megawatts of heat in for up to 50 years without causing any problems. And the only requirement I've been given by the coal authorities, you mustn't heat the water above 40 degrees centigrade, or apparently a lot of bacteria start growing. So as long as you don't heat the mine up too much, you can just plough your heat in, and then it acts as a battery, and buildings can then take it out with heat pumps later on. And we're in the middle of discussions with power companies about them working to take the heat out. And the final slide, you can see really all of these purple lines here are bits of the mines. They're extremely extensive. They've been around for hundreds of years. And I think this is a really novel way of doing something interesting with our heat. So in summary, the UK is definitely taking the advent of Exascale, the Exascale era, seriously. It's a complicated process that isn't finished yet to develop this outline business case. We've tried to align it very much with the infrastructure roadmap activity, which is still ongoing as well. And because of the long lead times, we're already having to invest. So the university has paid for the power supply, not the government. So I've simply taken a risk that I want to be the only place that can possibly host this system because we've already put the power in place. It takes you 2 years to get that much power. All right, thank you very much.